going to show you today the common issue with Detroit diesel engines surging RPMs at idle. This is a common problem on many different types of heavy-duty trucks, and I'm going to show you what the issue is and how to fix it. You just notice how, I don't know if you can hear it, but you can hear it surging, and you can see the RPM gauge moving slightly up and down at idle. So I'm about to run a fuel system integrity check on a Detroit diesel. This is to help you identify any problems with your fuel system, but I want to show you on the specific truck how this identifies the bad quantity control valve and the surging idle. So you go to your actions tab, then you go to fuel, you go to fuel system integrity check. You'll notice that if your coolant temperature is not up to the right temperature, etc., that it'll be in the red, and so you have to get all your temperatures and everything up. And that also you'll have to have the engine off, key on. Let me do that real quick. And what I want you to notice is that at idle, when I start the truck, the rail pressure actual versus the rail pressure desired is going to be off quite a bit. And notice too that that's in PSI, but your fuel rail pressure is in bar, and that's a big difference. You'll have to look up the conversion on bar to PSI, but just a like 10 bar is like hundreds of PSI, I do believe. So double check that. But so a little bit of variation from the desired to the actual in bar is actually a big variation, especially when these fuel rails get up to 30,000 PSI. So here we go. I'm going to start this so that you could see the difference. Now it's telling me to start the truck. Okay, now you can hear the truck at it's surging, and you can see that as it surges at idle, it drops down to like 100 bar difference between what it's desired and what is actual. And if you look up that difference in bar, it's a lot of difference in PSI. And so as this test runs through it, it's going to take you to different RPMs and different rail pressures. And if I was to let it go, you'll notice that as the rail pressure and the RPMs go up, it actually stabilizes. But what that quantity control valve does is it basically regulates the amount of fuel that your system's getting. And so when that's way off, as it is right now, it means you're going to be under and over fueling in different circumstances. And I'm having trouble with this thing clogging up the DOC with an extra amount of soot, and I'm thinking that this has something to do with it, because if it's over fueling, it's going to create more soot than it would normally. So I just looked up the conversion between bar and PSI so I could tell you, and it's 14.5 PSI to 1 bar. So if you're 100 bar difference between desired and actual, that's a 1450 PSI difference in what the rail pressure is calling for and what it's actually getting, whether that be above or below. That's a big difference. As you can see on this test, it's ramping up the engine RPM, and you can see that the desired and the actual is still pretty far off. So I'm going to replace that quantity control valve, and I'll show you the difference afterwards. See, this is like towards the end of the test, and it's trying to hold the rail PSI at 800, and this thing is jumping between all the way down to 500 to 800 bar. Like I said, 100 bar is 1450 psi. So that's thousands of psi difference between your rail and your desired during different applications of what the ECM or MCM is calling for in contrast to what it's desired. That's a big problem. So finish the test and you'll see that at the bottom it says system not leaking, which is fine, but we still have an issue because of that quantity control valve. Though the fuel system might not be leaking, it's obvious that there's a big problem with maintaining the desired rail pressure. And you see at the very top of that screen, it says rail pressure did not meet requirement. That's when it was trying to hold it at 800 psi or 800 bar, whichever it was. It wasn't maintaining that pressure, so it failed that part of the test. So here is the new quantity control valve, or a metering device, fuel meter as it's also called. There's a new one. It goes in like this, and there's three, I think it's Torx 27 or Torx 30-bit bolts that hold it in there. But it's pretty simple. Just a harness and those three bolts, pull it out, put it in, prime up your fuel system. That's it. The difficult part is getting to it. So I already took off the fender and moved some air lines and stuff, just bungeed them up here. I'll show you where the old quantity control valve is. If you look directly behind these fuel lines here, if I can get a good view, see that booger right there, the harness on it, and your Torx bit bolts. Yeah, that's it right there. So I can try to climb back there and get around all these fuel lines and stuff, or I can remove those fuel lines, which is probably what I'm going to have to do to get that out. But other than getting to it and getting it out and in, it's a fairly simple repair. I finally got my three bolts out, which, I'll be honest, it was a nightmare. I think on each one of these that I've done on different, DD13, DD15s, whatever, it seems like the setup's always a little bit different. This one is probably one of the worst I've done. There's like no room right here. So you might, if you're doing this yourself, want to take off, maybe some of these other flanges and manifolds or whatever. But I was able to very trickily get those screws out. Now I'm just going to pry with this flathead screwdriver to get the rest of the way out, because it's got these O-rings on it that basically keep it in there pretty well. So get a screwdriver or a pry bar and just pry it out like so. I'm going to put the camera down so I can actually do it, but you get the gist. The new quantity control valve is in. Had to remove quite a few fuel lines, but there it is. Just gonna hook it back up. All right, you can see that the RPM at idle is stable now. You don't hear the surging anymore. Now I'm gonna run another fuel system integrity check in order to show you how it fixed the difference between desired rail pressure and actual rail pressure. So let me hit start here. Okay, and it wants me to start the engine. Now you see how closely the desired and the actual rail pressure is now that I've replaced the quantity control valve. You don't have the surge at idle anymore, and they're almost identical. Whereas before, you saw that they were jumping all over the place. So that will help in a lot of areas. Particularly this one was building up a lot of soot on the DOC, and so I'm thinking that there was an overfueling issue. So that's what I'm going to verify. That's it.